last 30 years, with the development of the economies of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Qatar and the Emirates, you have, and then of course the migrant workers that go to Europe. It's often the case that the Muslim woman, especially in the poor classes, carries everything on her shoulders. The husband is away, often for years. She works probably 2 jobs at least. She raises the family. She looks out for the family. She has to see that they're disciplined and they're properly taken care of. There is no idea in reality, or there is no reality of the sheltered woman who is in the house of her husband, who's taking care of her, for the vast majority of Muslim women. The vast majority of Muslim women toil, and they are and men may see them in the Muslim world in particular ways, and men may conjure certain images of the woman, but they're often very different from the way that those women see themselves. And the average woman in the Muslim world sees herself as an economic heroine. She sees herself as a person who is defending her family, who is taking care of her family. This is the way that a poor Moroccan woman looks at herself. This is the way that many Egyptian women look at themselves. So here we come before a particular issue which is really important, and that is that generalizations often are very, very far off the mark. I mean, this is not to say that there are not problems in the Muslim world, and we have to look at those problems, but at the same time, the situation is much more complex than Westerners imagine. In terms of education, what is the status of Muslim women in the world today? Yeah, again, it really depends, doesn't it? It depends on the class, it depends on the society. The fact is, though, that education has spread over much of the Muslim world today, as it has other parts of the world, perhaps more so in many cases, so that many women in the Muslim world today are educated. And they have a point of view. Many of them are doctors. If you take some of the leading religious figures in the Arab world today, their daughters may have PhDs in chemistry, they may have doctorates in medicine, they may have other degrees. So another social reality is the fact that Muslim women are getting educations. And because they're getting educations, they're also demanding jobs, and they're also taking positions in society. The ability of the society to accommodate them is a really big issue. In countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, you have women's colleges and women's universities that are turning out a large number of graduates, some of them with master's and PhD degrees, and of course they want to be employed in the society and they want to have a voice in it. So a lot of the images that we have are not very accurate when it comes down to it, but nevertheless there are issues that concern women and that concern us as well that we need to look at. I'd like to start with the generalizations about the prophetic period. This is something that we'll talk about, inshallah, more next Saturday. But a point that is continually made by people who write about gender in Islam is the fact that there is a difference between the prophetic period and between periods that come after that. And in the prophetic period, the society was highly egalitarian. And it was a society in which social space was not segregated. And social space was not regulated in the way that became typical of some Islamic societies later on, especially urban societies and especially in the wealthy classes, or what we might call the moneyed classes, maybe the upper middle class if that term is suitable. In the Prophet's society, there is virtually no distinction between political space and between non-political space. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was everybody's neighbor, and you could see him and visit him. There wasn't a chamberlain that gave you permission to go into the palace or withheld that permission from you. He was accessible. He lived and he ate and he drank like everyone else did in the society. And there are issues that pertain to his wives. We'll talk about those next time. But women were a dynamic part of the prophetic society. They were seen in that society. They moved about in it. They took place in, they were active in the marketplace. They were active in the manufacture of clothing and goods. They were active even in the political process that came later on, because their opinions were taken and their oath of allegiance was considered to be essential. We find women in the society of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam even on the battlefield. When the Muslims went out to fight in the Battle of Uhud, women are there on the battlefield. And a particular woman, Nusayba or Nasiba, actually saves the Prophet's life. And she becomes one of the heroines of Islamic history. And she takes over 14 wounds in her protection of the Prophet. And she fights in every battle, or virtually every significant battle from that time on, even after the Prophet's death. And she goes out with the army as the heroine of the army. And when the army comes back from the battle against Musaylima, Abu Bakr walks out to see how she is. He walks out to receive her after having entrusted her to Khalid the general. So when we look at the prophetic society, we see an amazing situation. And that is that this was a society that was very dynamic and in which women played a very powerful role, and in which women could support men and often did support men. They earned money. They gave in charity. They were able to give in charity. And the money that they gave wasn't just money that they received by inheritance. It was also money that they earned. So this is a very important aspect. And as we'll see, Muslim women have written a great deal about gender over the last 20 years. Most Muslims who are writing about gender today are Muslim women. Most who are writing about gender in the Muslim world are Muslim women. And they cover a perspective of different voices. Some of them are secular, some of them are Islamic. But it's virtually a point of consensus, with the exception of maybe one or two, that when we as Muslims come to deal with the issue of gender, our problem is not in the texts, and it's not in the sources of the religion, and it's not in the prophetic example. In fact, that's where the liberation is. But rather, it's in the development of power structures that developed after that, and power structures that often took on the characteristics of the Persians and the Romans before them. Purda, for example, is an ancient Persian cultural vestige. So when the Muslims took on the culture of the Persians and the Romans and others, they often lived in their cities, of course, those people who had been Persians and Romans converted. So they brought a lot of the expectations and a lot of the ideals that they had. They created social structures which often paralleled those of the Persians and the Romans before them. Then, when you go into, if you will, the middle period or the medieval period, there is a change. This middle period is not like the prophetic period. And it has good aspects, it has bad, it has shadows, it has open areas, and we'll have to look at that. Nevertheless, the medieval period produced a great deal of famous women, just as the period of the prophet, the prophetic period, is a period that produces many great women. And this is one of the amazing things, that in Islam we have a legacy of women of stature. Women of stature in virtually all aspects of life. In politics, in the rule of the state, we have women who set things right when men couldn't do that. They made the state of affairs good, like the Queen of Sheba in ancient times. We have women on the battlefield. We have women in education. We have women in learning, and some of the greatest legal scholars are women. You have poets, you have mystics, you have benefactors, women who build cities and who restore cities, who take care of roads, who build endowments. So the middle period is not like the initial period in all ways, but still to believe that it was a write-off and that it was a dark age in which women were imprisoned in dungeons in which no light came, that's not really the case. It wasn't that simple. And in fact, we always want to keep in mind the question of comparison. That how were things in European society at that time? How were things in Hindu society at that time? How were things in China? So that we're talking about apples and apples and not apples and oranges. It's not really fair to look at the modern situation in which a different economic and cultural dynamic has called for the empowerment of people, and to compare that with the agrarian economy of the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, when we come into the 19th century, okay, the 18th century for Muslims, the 1700s, what is that like? How would you describe the 18th century, the 1700s, that end with Shah Waliullah of Delhi and with Muhammad ibn Abd-Allah? You have the Ottoman Empire at that time, very strong. The Mughal Empire is strong and declining. What is the 18th century like?
I think I would have much rather lived in the Muslim part of the world, certainly than in Europe.
Maybe. But what was the Muslim world like in the 18th century?
Depends where you are.
It depends on where you are, but...
Egypt was a dark age.
Huh?
We were programmed in Egypt to believe that was a dark age.
Well, actually, the 18th century is the beginning of the night. The 18th century is when the Muslim world begins to be turned inside out. And one of the reasons for that, we're getting way off the subject, but that's fun. One of the reasons for that is the discovery of this place right here. Chicago, no, America. America, the Americas. The discovery of South America, Central America, North America. What did that do? What happened when the Americas were discovered?
Massive gold and silver.
Brilliant. Gold and silver begin to come into Europe by the